In this video lecture, we're going to discuss the engineering principles that can be found in the cell. Now, engineering principles are common standards or accepted best practices that have been agreed upon in order to have a well-designed product. And these principles have been discovered throughout the ages through tinkering and error, trial and error. And so basically everything that has been built by man or is being currently built by man these days needs to adhere to these thought out engineering principles, because we've discovered through trial and error that if they don't, then they won't work quite as well. So ever since the middle of the 20th century, however, as molecular biology began to mature as a discipline, we've realized that there are engineering principles embodied by the cell as well. And so we're going to take a look at some of the different engineering principles in different engineering subdisciplines. The first thing we'll look at are general engineering principles. And Burstis has recently proposed 14 general engineering principles that really demarcate whether a discipline is an engineering discipline or not. And so in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a few of these general engineering principles and show that they also apply to living systems. And throughout this section, you'll see these different numberings. For example, general engineering principle number 3. These numberings refer to the way that Burstis numbered his 14 general engineering principles in reference number 1, which you can find at the end of the paper, at the end of the lecture. So the first one that we're going to talk about is general engineering principle number 3. So standards are used where available and applicable, with every departure from applicable standards explicitly justified. So how does the cell embody this engineering principle? Well, there are common design patterns called standards. In the man-made world, you have screw and nut sizes that are defined by standards, and they enable common components or patterns. And biological systems, of course, are ubiquitous with common components or patterns. For example, you have 20 amino acids, and these are standard across basically all life. You have 4 different nucleotides. You have ribosomes that all living things have, unless you count viruses as living things. Common metabolites. The genetic code. Genetic code. And of course, common pathways like signaling pathways, metabolic pathways, etc. All of these are standard across, if not all life, most of life. There are large domains of life that share these certain standards, and so you can actually have things swap in and out. Especially as scientists, we can do things like synthetic biology, etc. General engineering principle number 4. Future changes are anticipated, and engineering design minimizes the cost of modifications. Okay, so while it might be difficult to swallow the notion that biology anticipates future changes, living systems do embody 2 central traits associated with this principle, and those would be adaptability, and evolvability. General engineering principle number 5. Fault and failure tolerance are built into engineering designs, and cells exhibit this principle in multiple ways. For example, you'll often have redundant pathways. So when one goes wrong, the other one is still there. Or proteins, redundant proteins. You have proofreading. For like DNA. You have mechanisms for disposal of misfolded proteins, misfolded protein disposal, and the list goes on and on and on. You could also maybe even say the immune system is part of this. General engineering principle number 7. Efficient techniques are used to scale up size or production. So this occurs at both the level of single-celled organisms as well as multicellular. So for example, metabolic pathways, metabolic pathways are robust. They're robust to cell growth. So as the cell grows, then your metabolic pathways still work, cell growth, and then division, where suddenly the cell's volume gets cut in half, but things still work. In addition to that, you also have, in multicellular organisms, you have embryo patterns. Embryo patterns adapt to body size. So, for example, here you'll have this frog egg. You can cut it in half, and if you do it correctly, what you get are 2 tadpoles out of the 2 halves, and the 2 tadpoles are still proportioned correctly. It's not like one just inherits all head and the other one inherits just all tail, for example. General engineering principle number 12. Technological adventure is good engineering, provided the aim is to add to engineering knowledge. So that seems weird, but if you take a look at this, you would have biological innovation, and it often comes as the result of exposure to new niches and environments. And what's called biological adventure also occurs in, for example, things like persistence switches, which I'm not going to get into, but you can find it in this reference here. The next kind of engineering principle that we're going to look at are hardware-software engineering co-design principles. So, if we mark this part out right here, because we didn't see a previous lecture on this. But take my word for it that the cell comprises what's called an embedded computing system. Now, an embedded computing system, in contrast to computing systems that most people are familiar with, say your personal computer, even your cell phone, embedded computing systems are ones that are put into a piece of hardware specifically designed just for that computing system. An example of this would be the cruise control computer or your onboard computer on your car. You can't take that computer out of the car and have it function in the way that it was designed to function. Or the autopilot on an airplane that is designed to be in an airplane and to control the different parts of an airplane. So the cell is a computing system in the same way. So because of that, for these particular types of computing systems, the software and the hardware need to be designed together. And one issue with that is that there are profound difficulties in doing these things, because when they are designed together, then you have to have the software engineer and the hardware engineer working together. And so because of this, hardware-software co-design engineering principles have been proposed, 3 of which we're going to discuss here. So the first one is that functions to be implemented are partitioned into smaller interacting pieces. So this is seen in the modularity of computer hardware and software, which has subroutine modules that are linked together. Now the cell has similar characteristics. For example, each protein acts as autonomous code execution. Each protein is doing its function all by itself. Sometimes they team up with other proteins, but they are still relatively independent. Regulatory networks and metabolic pathways are modular, which means you can look at, for example, a gene regulatory network where some genes influence the expression of other genes, and those other genes influence the expression of still others. When you put together enough connections like that, what you get is a very large gene regulatory network. Well, a subset of that gene regulatory network may go on to do a particular function, while another part of the gene regulatory network may do another function. And so these act relatively independently of one another, and so they're modular. Principle number 2. Those partitions that we were just talking about are allocated to microprocessors or other hardware units, where the function may be implemented directly in hardware or in software running on a microprocessor. So maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, but basically what we're talking about here is, first of all, the ideal would be to have separate processor for each function. And of course, that's not possible if you're designing an embedded computing system made by man. But in the cell, each protein acts as autonomous processor for its specified function. And so you actually do almost have that, because you have the DNA, if you think of that as code, acting massively in parallel, making all these different proteins, and each protein can act as its own autonomous piece of code being executed. Number 3. The timing of execution of functions is rigorously scheduled. This is important when several functional partitions share one hardware unit. So there are common clock and timing mechanisms found in biology. You have circadian rhythms. You have the cell cycle, of course, cell cycle. You have seasonal clocks that go on. Other clocks that can be found in biology, there's one in a process called somatogenesis, which is the creation of the muscle tissue that surrounds what will eventually be the vertebrate spinal column. Flagellum synthesis is another example, where you have the bacterial flagellum that has all the parts have to be put together in just the right order at just the right time. And so, of course, in the cell, the timing of the execution of functions is rigorously scheduled.